I was born long after the Mongol Empire had already begun to fade from power, but the stories were never lost. My father told them to me the same way his father told them to him, as the memory of our Mongol ancestors who once rode across the Eurasian steppe. He said his grandfather had lived during the time when the Mongol clans were still divided, separate families and tribal groups competing for land, animals, and survival. In those years, loyalty to one's own Mongol clan meant everything. There were no cities to defend us, no walls, only open grassland stretching beyond the horizon. According to the stories passed down through our family, my great-grandfather was born before the rise of Temüjin, the man later known as Genghis Khan, when alliances between Mongol clans shifted constantly. He lived in a world where children learned to ride before they could walk steadily, where horses were not only transport, but the foundation of survival. My grandfather told my father that everything began to change when word spread across the steppe that Temüjin was uniting the Mongol clans into a single force. What had once been scattered tribal groups were becoming something larger. An organized society, a coordinated army. And now those same stories have reached me. I did not see the empire at its height, but I carry the memory of those who did. Today I will tell the story that passed from my great-grandfather to my grandfather to my father, the story of how the Mongol people rose from life on the open steppe to create one of the largest empires in history. Part 1. Life on the Eurasian steppe. The stories my father carried did not begin with war. They began with the land. According to the accounts passed down through our Mongol ancestors, life on the Eurasian steppe was defined first by movement. The grasslands stretched across thousands of kilometers, interrupted only by rivers, low hills, and distant mountain ranges. There were no permanent city walls, no fixed roads, only open terrain shaped by seasons that could change quickly and without warning. For the Mongol clans who lived there, survival depended on understanding the rhythm of the land. Families traveled with their herds, following fresh grazing areas as conditions shifted. Their homes were portable circular felt dwellings that could be dismantled, loaded onto animals, and rebuilt within hours. These mobile homes allowed entire communities to relocate without losing their shelter. My grandfather used to describe how children learned essential skills from a very young age. Riding was not treated as a separate activity. It was part of daily life. A child who could not ride would struggle to keep pace with the movement of the group. Horses were central to everything. They provided transport across long distances. They supplied milk, which could be fermented and preserved. They allowed hunters to pursue game efficiently across open terrain. Many steppe families kept several horses for each rider, ensuring that animals could be rotated and rested. This constant mobility produced riders capable of traveling farther and faster than most settled populations. Social organization reflected these conditions. Instead of centralized governments, authority existed within extended family groups and clan leaders. Loyalty was reinforced through shared work, mutual defense, and the need to protect herds from theft or attack. Conflicts between neighboring Mongol clans were common. Competition for pasture land and resources could quickly lead to raids. At the same time, alliances were equally important. Clans cooperated when larger threats appeared or when trade opportunities emerged. Communication across the open steppe relied heavily on mounted messengers. Riders could carry news of danger or opportunity across large distances in relatively short periods. This ability to transmit information quickly later became a critical advantage in military coordination. According to both historical sources and family stories preserved through generations, life on the steppe demanded resilience. Winters could be harsh. Livestock losses meant reduced food and mobility. Each season required constant adaptation. These environmental pressures gradually produced a population skilled in endurance, navigation, and rapid response. Long before the Mongol Empire existed, the land itself had already trained its people in the skills that would later define their success. The rise of Temüjin did not create those abilities. It unified and directed them. Understanding this foundation is essential, because without the environment of the Eurasian steppe and the lifestyle shaped by it, the later expansion of the Mongol Empire would not have been possible. Part 2. The Rise of Temüjin. My father always said that when his grandfather spoke of the years before the Mongol Empire, his voice changed. He described a time when the Mongol clans of the eastern Eurasian steppe were not united under a single banner. Instead, groups such as the Borjigin, Taishid, Merkit, and other steppe confederations competed constantly for grazing land, livestock, and influence. Life in that environment required readiness. Herds had to be protected. Encampments could be moved quickly. Trust was given cautiously, because alliances between clans could shift from cooperation to conflict within a single season. According to the stories passed through our family, my great-grandfather was born during those unsettled years. He would have grown up learning the same skills every child on the steppe learned: riding, herding, hunting, and watching the horizon for approaching riders. These were not optional abilities. They were necessary for survival. Historical sources tell us that Temüjin, later known as Genghis Khan, was born into the same environment during the mid-12th century. After his father, Yasugari, was killed by rivals, Temüjin's family lost its protection. Without the support of allied clans, they were forced to survive with limited resources. They hunted small game. They gathered what they could. For several years, their status within the steppe hierarchy was uncertain. This period of hardship appears frequently in early accounts because it shaped Temüjin as later leadership. Rather than relying solely on traditional lineage, he began building loyalty through shared hardship and demonstrated ability. The stories handed down through our family describe riders choosing to follow him not because of inherited rank, but because he offered stability and reward for discipline. Over time, Temüjin formed alliances with other influential leaders. One of the most significant was Togrul, head of the Kara Confederation, who provided early military support. Another was Jamuka, originally his close companion and sworn brother. Their partnership eventually fractured, leading to open conflict. These struggles were not isolated skirmishes. They were part of a larger contest for influence across the eastern steppe. Each victory brought new followers. Each defeat forced adaptation. Temüjin began reorganizing his forces in ways that reduced traditional clan divisions. Members of different Mongol clans were mixed together into structured units. This system, based on groups of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000, allowed commanders to coordinate movement over large distances. It also weakened older loyalties that might disrupt discipline. According to historical accounts, this organizational structure became one of the defining strengths of Mongol military operations. Orders could be transmitted quickly. Units could be redeployed efficiently. Responsibility was clearly assigned. The stories passed down in my family do not preserve the names of every battle, but they remember the change in atmosphere. What had once been constant rivalry between neighboring groups gradually shifted toward a shared purpose. By the early 13th century, Temüjin had defeated or absorbed several major confederations that had previously resisted his authority. In the year 1206, a gathering known as a Kurultai was held. Leaders from multiple Mongol groups recognized his authority and granted him the title Genghis Khan. This moment marked more than a political elevation. It represented the transformation of scattered Mongol clans into a coordinated entity capable of sustained expansion. My father always described this as the point in the story where the horizon widened. What had once been a life defined by local survival began to extend beyond the familiar grasslands. From that moment forward, campaigns expanded outward. Armies moved east toward northern China. Others moved west across Central Asia. The skills that had once allowed small groups to survive harsh winters, endurance, mobility, discipline were now applied on a much larger scale. For those who lived through the transition, the shift must have felt immediate. For later generations, like my grandfather and my father, it became a memory carried through repeated telling. They spoke less about individual victories and more about the change itself. A change from fragmentation to coordination, from isolated clans to a unified command. That transformation, once set in motion, would shape not only the lives of those first riders, but also the generations that followed them across continents. Part 3. The Mongol military system and expansion. According to the stories passed down through my family, the change after Temüjin became Genghis Khan was not only about leadership. It was about organization. My grandfather used to say that our ancestors did not suddenly become stronger. They became coordinated. This is the story of the Mongol army, an engine of conquest that redrew the map of the world. Let's travel back to the late 12th century. The Mongol tribes were disunited, often fighting amongst themselves. But one man, Temüjin, would change everything. After a brutal early life, he unified the tribes through a combination of diplomacy, strategic alliances, and sheer military genius. In 1206, he was proclaimed Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. His first and most crucial reform was to dismantle the old tribal loyalties that had caused so much division. He reorganized his people and his army not by clan or kinship, but into a strict, decimal-based system. This system was brilliantly simple yet incredibly effective. The smallest unit was the Arbin, a squad of 10 men. These 10 soldiers were often from different tribes, but were bound together by an oath of loyalty. They fought together, lived together, and were responsible for one another. If one man deserted or failed in his duty, the entire Arbin could be punished, even executed. This fostered an unbreakable sense of camaraderie and discipline. 10 Arbins formed a Zuan, a company of 100 men. 10 Zuans made a Mingan, a battalion of 1,000. And 10 Mingans formed the largest operational unit, the Temüjin, a division of 10,000 warriors. Each unit had its own commander, appointed based on merit, skill, and loyalty, not on noble birth. This meritocratic approach ensured that the most capable leaders rose through the ranks, creating a highly efficient command structure. Genghis Khan's own sons and most trusted generals commanded the Temüjins, allowing for rapid and coordinated movements across vast territories. Discipline was the bedrock of this entire system. The Yasa, the secret legal code of the Mongols, laid down strict rules. Disobedience, cowardice, and desertion were punishable by death. This wasn't just about punishment. It was about creating a perfectly synchronized fighting force. Every soldier knew their exact role and followed orders without question. This iron discipline allowed Mongol commanders to execute complex maneuvers on the battlefield with a precision that stunned their opponents. How did they communicate these orders across miles of chaotic battlefield or hundreds of miles of open steppe? They used a sophisticated system of signals. Flags of different colors and patterns, whistling arrows that made a distinct sound, horns and drums, were all used to transmit commands quickly and effectively. At night, lanterns and signal fires took over. For long-distance communication, the Mongols established the Yam, an incredibly efficient postal relay system. A network of stations, stocked with fresh horses and supplies, allowed messengers to travel up to 200 miles a day. This Pony Express of the steppes gave Mongol leaders a huge strategic advantage, allowing them to gather intelligence and coordinate their armies faster than any of their rivals. But the true heart of the Mongol army was the horse. A Mongol warrior was practically born in the saddle. They learned to ride as toddlers and were masters of horsemanship. Each warrior maintained a string of 3 to 5 tough, resilient steppe ponies. These horses were not large, but they were incredibly hardy, able to survive on sparse vegetation and withstand extreme temperatures. By switching between mounts, a Mongol soldier could cover immense distances without exhausting his horses. This unparalleled mobility was their greatest weapon. The Mongol army could appear as if from nowhere, strike with devastating speed, and vanish before an enemy could mount a proper response. They were the original blitzkrieg, a lightning war on horseback. What about their equipment? The typical Mongol warrior was a horse archer, a composite role that made them doubly deadly. Their primary weapon was the formidable Mongol composite bow. Made from horns, sinew, and wood, it was smaller than European longbows, but incredibly powerful and could be fired accurately from horseback. A skilled archer could shoot a volley of arrows with astonishing speed. They carried multiple types of arrows. Heavy ones for piercing armor, light ones for long-range volleys, and even whistling arrows for signaling. For close combat, they carried a variety of weapons, including a curved saber, a lance with a hook for pulling enemies from their saddles, a mace, and a battle axe. For protection, they wore armor made of hardened leather or lamellar armor, which consisted of small, overlapping metal plates stitched together. This was lighter than the heavy chainmail or plate armor of European knights, giving them greater mobility without sacrificing too much protection. Their iconic conical helmet, often adorned with a horsehair plume, completed the look. Now let's talk tactics. The Mongols were masters of psychological warfare. Before a battle, they would often offer terms of surrender. If a city submitted peacefully, its people were usually spared. But if they resisted, the Mongols would unleash hell. They would use terror as a weapon, committing massacres that sent a chilling message to other cities in their path. The goal was to break the enemy's will to fight before the battle even began. On the battlefield, their tactics were fluid and deceptive. A favorite maneuver was the feigned retreat. A portion of the Mongol army would pretend to flee in disarray, luring the enemy into a disorganized pursuit. Once the enemy was overextended and their formation was broken, the fleeing Mongols would suddenly turn, joined by hidden reserves that would envelop and annihilate the now trapped force. They also used flanking and encirclement tactics with deadly efficiency. Their tumens would spread out over a wide front, using their mobility to outmaneuver and surround their opponents. They would shower the enemy with arrows from all sides, a storm of arrows that weakened and demoralized them before the final, decisive charge with lances and sabers. The Mongols were also surprisingly adept at siege warfare, a skill they learned and perfected as their conquests moved from the open plains to the walled cities of China, Persia, and Russia. Initially, they lacked the expertise for sieges, but they were quick learners. They would capture engineers and skilled craftsmen from conquered populations and force them to build siege engines. They employed massive trebuchets that could hurl huge rocks, flaming projectiles, and even diseased animal carcasses over city walls to spread plague. They built catapults, battering rams, and siege towers. They would divert rivers to flood cities or cut off water supplies to starve them into submission. No obstacle seemed too great. With this military system in place, the Mongol expansion was breathtakingly rapid. Under Genghis Khan, they conquered the Khwarezmian Empire in Persia, laying waste to legendary cities like Samarkand and Bukhara. After his death in 1227, the expansion continued under his sons and grandsons. His son Agade Khan pushed west. One army, led by the general Sabbatai and Genghis's grandson Beta, swept into Russia. The Rus principalities, disunited and unprepared, were crushed one by one. The Mongols then stormed into Europe, annihilating a combined Polish and German army at the Battle of Legnica and a Hungarian army at the Battle of Mohi in 1241, all within 2 days of each other. Europe was terrified, seemingly powerless to stop the Devil's Horsemen. The invasion only halted because of the unexpected death of Agade Khan, which required all Mongol princes to return to Mongolia to elect a new leader. In the east, Kublai Khan, another of Genghis's grandsons, completed the conquest of China, a feat that had eluded his grandfather. He defeated the mighty Song dynasty in 1279 and established the Yuan dynasty, ruling as Emperor of China. At its zenith, the Mongol Empire stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Danube River, from Siberia to the Persian Gulf. It was an empire forged in the saddle, built on discipline, mobility, and a terrifyingly effective military strategy. While often remembered for its brutality, the Mongol Empire also created the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace. For a century, they secured the Silk Road, making trade and travel between East and West safer than ever before. This facilitated an unprecedented exchange of goods, ideas, technologies, and cultures. Gunpowder, the compass, and printing made their way to Europe, while Western knowledge flowed east. The Mongol military system was a product of its environment and the genius of its founder. It combined the traditional skills of the steppe nomad with brilliant organization, unforgiving discipline, and a willingness to adapt and adopt new technologies. It was a force that transformed the world, leaving a legacy that is still felt today. The story of the Mongol army is a powerful testament to how a united, disciplined, and innovative force can achieve the seemingly impossible. Part 4. How the Mongol Empire was governed. According to the stories my father received from his father, the greatest change our ancestors remembered was not only the expansion of territory, but the way distant lands became connected. The Mongol Empire did not rely solely on military movement. It depended on organization that stretched far beyond the battlefield. After the early campaigns, leadership recognized that controlling vast distances required reliable communication. A network of relay stations was established across major routes. Mounted couriers could travel between these stations, exchanging exhausted horses for rested ones. This system allowed messages to cross enormous distances far faster than most neighboring states could manage. Historical records describe this network as one of the most effective communication systems of its time. Orders, intelligence, and administrative instructions could be transmitted across the empire in a fraction of the time previously required. My grandfather's stories often describe these relay stations as places where riders never fully stopped, only paused long enough to exchange mounts and continue. Trade routes were also protected. Merchants traveling across regions once divided by conflict found increasing security under Mongol oversight. Caravans moved along routes that later generations would associate with the Silk Road. This protection encouraged exchange of goods, technologies, and ideas between East and West. Administration across conquered territories required adaptation. Local officials were often retained if they agreed to cooperate. Taxation systems were reorganized to ensure resources continued flowing towards central authority. In many areas, the Mongols allowed existing religious and cultural practices to continue, provided that loyalty and tribute were maintained. This pragmatic approach reduced resistance in regions where direct control would have been difficult. Legal authority was also formalized through a body of regulations commonly associated with Genghis Khan's rule. These laws emphasized discipline, loyalty, and order within both military and civilian structures. For the generations who followed, the empire was remembered not only for conquest, but for connection. Routes that had once been dangerous became passable. Information that once moved slowly began traveling across continents. My father used to say that the stories of our ancestors did not describe an empire built only on force. They described one maintained through coordination. Yet, even a system built on speed and organization could encounter limits. Not every landscape favored mounted armies. Not every campaign could be sustained across unfamiliar terrain. The next stories in our family spoke of attempts to cross the sea in an environment very different from the open steppe. It was there, beyond the mainland, that the expansion of the Mongol Empire faced one of its most significant challenges. Part 5. The Invasions of Japan. The stories my father received from his father always grew quieter when they reached the edge of the sea. Our ancestors were riders of open land. They understood distance measured in grass and horizon. But the ocean could not be crossed on horseback. By the late 13th century, the Mongol Empire had already extended across vast regions of Asia. Under the rule of Kublai Khan, attention turned east toward the islands of Japan. According to historical records, the first invasion fleet departed in the year 1274. The ships carried a combined force of Mongol, Korean, and northern Chinese soldiers. For many among them, this was unfamiliar territory. Naval warfare demanded coordination across water, reliance on wind, and discipline in confined space. As the fleet approached the coast of Kyushu, defenders prepared. Japanese warriors later remembered as samurai gathered along the shoreline, armed with bows, spears, and curved swords designed for close combat. When the first landings began, the difference in fighting styles became immediately apparent. Mongol forces relied on coordinated formations and massed projectile fire. Arrows were released in rapid succession from archers positioned on ships and landing parties. Explosive devices, early gunpowder weapons recorded in contemporary accounts, were deployed to disrupt enemy formations. The noise alone was enough to unsettle opponents unfamiliar with such weapons. Japanese defenders responded with individual combat traditions. Mounted and foot soldiers engaged in close-range fighting when landing forces reached the shore. The terrain limited the invaders' ability to deploy large formations. Skirmishes continued through the day. Neither side secured a decisive position. As night approached, Mongol commanders withdrew to their ships to regroup. Then the weather shifted. A storm moved across the fleet. Waves damaged vessels anchored offshore. Faced with worsening conditions, the invasion force withdrew. The attempt had demonstrated strength but not control. Several years later, preparations began again. In 1281, a second invasion was organized on a far larger scale. Two fleets were assembled, one departing from Korea, the other from southern China. Together, they represented one of the largest amphibious forces assembled in the medieval world. When they approached Japan, defenders were no longer unprepared. Coastal fortifications had been constructed. Landing sites were defended more heavily. Repeated attempts to establish a foothold were met with resistance. Battles occurred along beaches and shallow waters, where coordination between ships and land forces was difficult. Archers exchanged volleys across narrow distances. Boarding actions and close combat occurred where vessels were forced together by currents. Days stretched into weeks without decisive progress. Then, once again, the weather changed. A powerful typhoon moved across the region. Ships were driven into each other. Anchored vessels broke free. Many were damaged or destroyed by waves and wind. In Japanese tradition, this storm became known as the kamikaze, the divine wind. For the Mongol leadership, it marked the limit of expansion across the sea. The empire that had crossed deserts, mountains, and rivers with speed now faced an environment that could not be controlled through mobility alone. The stories passed through my family did not describe this moment as a single defeat. They described it as a lesson, that even the most organized force could be slowed or stopped by terrain and conditions beyond its experience. After these events, large-scale invasion of Japan was not attempted again. For generations who remembered the empire through story, the sea remained the place where the horizon no longer guaranteed victory. The two fleets approached Japan. As the story passed down through our family described it, the second attempt to reach Japan did not begin from a single port. Two separate fleets moved across the sea. One departed from the Korean peninsula, carrying soldiers and supplies assembled under Mongol command. The other set sail from ports in southern China, traveling a longer route across open water. On the map, these forces appear as two advancing lines, one approaching from the northwest, the other from the southwest. Their goal was coordination. If both fleets could unite near the Japanese coast, their combined strength would overwhelm local defenses. But distance made timing difficult. The fleet from Korea reached the islands first. It attempted landings along the coast of Kyushu, testing defensive positions and searching for ground that could support a larger force. Meanwhile, the Southern Fleet was still crossing the East China Sea. Winds, currents, and the limitations of medieval navigation slowed progress. When the Second Fleet finally arrived, the combined armada was massive. Ships crowded coastal waters. Communication between commanders became a challenge. Part 6: Expansion toward the west. After the failed attempts to cross the sea, the stories passed down through my family always returned to the lands where our ancestors had first mastered movement. The open steppe, the deserts beyond it, the roads that led west. Long before the campaigns toward Japan, Mongol armies had already begun expanding across Central Asia. According to historical accounts, one of the most significant turning points came with the conflict against the Khwarezmian Empire. This region controlled major trade routes and cities that connected eastern and western markets. At first, contact between the Mongols and Khwarezmian leadership was diplomatic. Trade envoys were sent. Communication was attempted. But when several Mongol representatives were killed during negotiations, the situation changed rapidly. The response was immediate and organized. Armies moved west across vast distances with speed that surprised every opponent. Cities that resisted faced siege. Those that surrendered were often incorporated into the expanding network of controlled territory. According to both historical records and the stories repeated through generations, Mongol forces did not advance in a single line. They moved in multiple coordinated columns. Each group traveled independently, yet remained connected through messengers and shared objectives. This allowed them to appear unexpectedly across wide regions. Caravans that once traveled slowly now encountered mounted units capable of covering enormous distances in a short time. After securing Central Asia, the expansion continued toward Eastern Europe. Campaigns reached regions that are now part of modern-day Russia, Ukraine, and Hungary. Rivers, forests, and unfamiliar terrain did not stop movement entirely. Mounted archers adapted their tactics to new environments. Some local armies attempted to confront the Mongols directly. Others withdrew, hoping distance would slow the advance. Yet the same principles that had unified the steppe were still in effect. Mobility, communication, discipline. Battles, such as those along the Kalka River, demonstrated how coordinated maneuver could break formations that relied on slower response. To later generations, including my grandfather, who repeated these stories by the fire, The westward campaigns represented the moment when the Mongol world extended far beyond the horizon of the original clans. Riders who had once known only grassland now crossed mountains, rivers, and foreign cities. What had begun as survival on the steppe had become influence across continents. But expansion at that scale created new challenges. Distance made unified control harder. Commanders governed regions separated by thousands of kilometers. And over time, even the most efficient system began to stretch. Part 7. How the Silk Road flourished under Mongol rule. The stories my father received from his father always changed again after the years of conquest. The tone shifted from movement and battle to something quieter. Travel, trade, connection. For generations who lived under Mongol authority, the greatest transformation was not always measured in territory gained, but in distance made safe. Before the Mongol expansion, the routes we now call the Silk Road existed as fragmented networks. Caravans traveled between cities across Central Asia, but each region carried its own risks. Borders were controlled by competing powers. Bandit attacks were common. Merchants often needed separate agreements at every stage of their journey. According to historical accounts, the consolidation of territory under Mongol rule created something unusual for the medieval world. A vast land corridor stretching from East Asia toward Europe was brought under coordinated administration. The same communication networks that had supported military movement were now used to support travel and commerce. Relay stations originally built for messengers became places where officials, envoys, and merchants could find fresh animals, supplies, and protection. These routes allowed information to move with unprecedented speed. A trader leaving northern China could travel west across Central Asia with fewer interruptions than had previously been possible. Caravans carried silk, spices, metals, textiles, and crafted goods. But the exchange was not limited to material trade. Technologies moved with the merchants. Knowledge of papermaking, printing methods, and engineering techniques spread between cultures that had once been separated by distance and conflict. Ideas traveled alongside cargo. Religious traditions, artistic styles, and scientific observations crossed regions through the same protected routes. My grandfather's stories describe this period not as an age of constant conquest, but as a time when movement itself became easier. Riders who once served only military commands now escorted caravans. Officials monitored routes to reduce theft. Travel documents were sometimes issued to authorized merchants, granting safe passage across territories controlled by different Mongol administrations. For those living along these corridors, markets grew. Cities that sat along major routes expanded in importance. Places that had once been isolated became connected nodes in a wider system. Historians often describe this period as a time of increased exchange between East and West, not because conflict had disappeared, but because large sections of the route were maintained under a single overarching authority. Yet this system depended on coordination across enormous distances. As generations passed, control gradually divided between regional khanates. Communication slowed. Protection became less consistent. The same routes that had flourished began to face renewed fragmentation. Even so, the memory of that connected network remained. The stories preserved by later generations did not focus only on the battles that created the empire. They also remembered the roads that allowed people, goods, and ideas to move farther than they ever had before. In that sense, the Mongol expansion did not only reshape borders. It reshaped how distant parts of the world interacted. Part 8. Fragmentation and Lasting Legacy of the Mongol Empire. The stories my father received from his father never ended with conquest. They ended with distance. An empire built on speed and coordination eventually faced the limits of its own size. As generations passed, the territories once united under a single command began to divide into separate khanates. Regional leaders governed lands that were now separated by thousands of kilometers. Communication that had once moved quickly along relay routes began to slow. Local priorities replaced centralized direction. In the east, the Yuan dynasty continued to rule parts of China. In the west, other successor states controlled regions across Central Asia and Eastern Europe. Each maintained elements of the systems first established during the early expansion. Yet the unified structure that had allowed orders to travel from one end of the empire to the other gradually faded. Trade routes remained active for a time, but protection became less consistent. Some corridors that had once been secure again faced conflict and instability.
Even so, the changes introduced during the height of Mongol control did not disappear.
Connections between distant regions had already been established. Technologies, goods, and knowledge had moved across continents. Ideas that once traveled slowly had crossed vast distances. My grandfather used to say that the empire itself did not vanish in a single moment. Instead, it transformed. The riders who once moved under one banner became part of many different societies. Their descendants lived across lands that stretched from East Asia to Europe. The influence of their systems, communication networks, trade protection, administrative organization continued shaping the regions they had once crossed. For later generations, the memory of the Mongols was not defined only by conquest. It was also defined by connection. A people who began as scattered clans on the open steppe had reshaped how distant parts of the world interacted. The horizon that once marked the edge of survival had become a pathway linking continents. And although the empire itself eventually divided, the roots, ideas, and exchanges it enabled continued long after the last unified command disappeared. The stories passed down through our family ended not with a final battle, but with a quieter understanding. That movement, once set in motion across the steppe, had changed the world in ways that could not be undone. If you enjoyed this journey through the rise, expansion, and legacy of the Mongol Empire, consider subscribing to follow the next chapter.
And let us know which civilization or era you'd like to explore next.